Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Howard here with another edition of Those Were the Days Extended. Today we are actually going to talk about one of my favorite couples that we've seen over the years, and that of course is the Wesleys. I think they were all in all on a sort of brief period of time in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I think they just had such a lasting effect between what they brought to the show, and then they periodically have come back and forth over the years. So yeah, we're going to get started here with my first picture here, and we are starting. I'm actually going to take you back to this is actually June 18th, 1998, and this is when Patrika Darbo was introduced as Nancy Wesley, Craig's beloved, sort of spirited wife, who was sort of in an interesting way, fun way, sort of the mastermind behind like her husband's career and schemes. And if you're watching back then, you remember that actually Craig was sort of introduced beforehand at a conference we'll get into a little bit later. So he was introduced a little while longer, and then we sort of marked him as a little bit of a villain or a little bit of a rival to Mike Horton here. And then he kind of briefly mentioned his wife, and it was just kind of out in the ether. And then they actually brought her on, and this is that again. That was Patrika Darbo here, just his signature bubbly personality and red hair coming onto the scene in Days here. And I remember the scene specifically when they debuted, and I don't think we knew what we were in for when we were getting the Wesleys. But yeah, to give you a little bit of background, if you weren't watching then, what was going on at the show is that Mike and Carrie were sort of kind of coming into their own. They weren't officially a couple then, but the wheels were turning. They were getting them started, and they were sort of pulling her away out of the orbit of the Austin and Carrie stuff she had been dealing with for the past few years, and that sort of quad with Lucas and all that stuff. So they were sort of cementing her and establishing that this new relationship was going to be Mike and Carrie. And they sort of again wanted to pull them away from Austin, Sammy, Lucas, Kate, all that stuff, and sort of give them their own storyline as they sort of ventured into this new coupledom for them. And so they decided to enter biggest obstacle centered around the hospital. Mike, of course, was the doctor there. Carrie at the time worked there as I think she was head of public relations. So they were getting together, they're having feelings, they're working together. And the storyline was that they were sort of Craig and Nancy sort of came in as these rivals to them. And of course, I love this picture because it just encapsulates sort of what Craig and Nancy were. They were this fun-loving, scheming couple who you really just love to hate and eventually just love them. And I'm curious to know, I was trying to find some research in if these characters were intended to kind of be on the scene and stay on the scene and really develop them, or were they just coming in for this like capsule storyline regarding Mike and Carrie? And I haven't gotten anything definitive, but I'm assuming they were sort of brought in to mix things up a bit and to add some sort of new blood to Salem. But yeah, if you weren't watching at the time, give you a brief little history here of our Craig and Nancy. Again, originally came to town as a counter to Mike and Carrie. Craig actually is an old medical school rival of Mike Horton's, and so it already, once he sort of came on screen, it sort of set up the dynamic of they knew each other, but there was also some tension there, and there was a rivalry there. And I think Craig sort of always felt maybe he was better than Mike, and always sort of wanted to kind of one up him. I don't think Mike really cared that much. I think he just found Craig to be sort of obnoxious and a bit of a try hard kind of a thing. So it immediately set it up that there's a little bit of tension with these two guys, even though they're sort of pretending or playing sort of nice nasty kind of with each other. But basically, yeah, they come to Salem. Craig is sort of coming to try and get the chief of staff job that also Mike is up for. And so there was a lot of scheming to sort of get Mike ousted and to sort of implant Craig as the chief of staff. There was sort of Nancy, if you remember, she sort of got herself a job as like sort of the head volunteer or a head candy striper And so she implanted herself there so that while she was there, she could sort of help pull the strings of Craig's career and to make sure everything, the goal was to get Craig as chief of staff. And it was by any means necessary. They even found an old girlfriend of Mike's who was a nurse there. I think Nurse Allie, if you guys remember. Craig and Nancy sort of manipulated her to like file this kind of like a sexual harassment suit against Mike so that it would muddy the waters and sort of disqualify him from chief of staff so that Craig could sort of swoop in and take the job. And they were just this fun-loving couple who came in and just wanted to scheme, and you just really, you, like I said, you love to hate them. And you saw that there was a charm to them. I think what really sold it is, of course, this Karen Spiritus and Patricia Darbo. Their on-screen chemistry was just off the charts. You sort of got why they were together. They were sort of two peas in a pod. They were sort of couples goals, and you just got it. I think you got this couple instantly. And it's funny because even though people at the time were really loving Mike and Carrie and what that dynamic was bringing, having another couple come in as sort of a rival to them in a professional manner was sort of interesting because you found that the audience was sort of split. They sort of wanted Mike and Carrie to succeed, but they also appreciated sort of Craig and Nancy and their shenanigans and what they represented, and they just completely sold it. And that, I think, they sort of, it was a perfect time to bring two people like this in and sort of pair them opposite Mike and Carrie, who very much relied on the fact that they were sort of the good guys, and sort of bring sort of rivals in that were a little bit more bubbly and had just a bit more personality as a couple, to sort of rival them. I think just worked out perfectly. And again, like I said, they were an unconventional sort of soap opera couple, very incredibly loving with each other, willing to do anything for each other. They were madly in love. And I think just sort of behind the scenes stuff, there was a lot, and there's still to this day, is just a lot of discourse about these two people and them coming together and representation on screen. And I think we're always up for people being able to identify and see themselves, and representation matters, especially seeing more full-figured women like Patricia Darbo at the time. I think for me, there was so much discourse about her weight. I think that a lot of people just missed it a bit outside of representation and what she brought to it, and seeing her and having her on screen. I think that was great. But I think, again, a lot of sort of internet chatter as it was sort of starting was just a lot of focus on her weight and attention. I'm glad that the show didn't delve into that. I'm glad that the show, what they showed us was a representation of this really loving couple who loved each other. They were willing to scheme together. They had great personality, and they were just really 100% sort of ride or die devoted to each other. And I really appreciated that. I like the fact that we didn't get sort of storylines about, Nancy's weight and Craig looks like this and she looks like that. It was like, it was just not needed. Don't think it was necessary. And I'm glad that the writers sort of stayed clear of that. I think just looking at this picture now, these two people, to me, they're equally yoked. They're fun loving, they get each other, and they completely sold it. And that, of course, was just you got to give it up to the talents of Kevin Spiritus and Patricia Darbo here. They really, really sold this couple, especially coming in. So I'm glad that the show never delved into sort of maybe behind the scenes chatter or what people were wondering. Like I said, I think there was a little bit too much discourse on that and not enough on seeing them as full-fledged characters, and what they represented for the show. So yeah, that was sort of their first iteration. As sort of Mike and Carrie were wrapping up their run, they sort of left town, and Craig actually did become chief of staff. And at that point, I think the writers were like, okay, if Mike and Carrie are gone, what do we do with this? This couple here? They now have sort of accomplished what we brought them in to do, was to sort of give a little trouble for this couple here, who again is leaving now, and now they've accomplished their goals. Craig is chief of staff. Nancy is feeling like a accomplished Machiavellian here in all of her schemes. And then it was like, okay, so what next for this couple? And then, of course, we were then introduced to the next iteration of Craig and Nancy was sort of the Wesleys. And if you remember this storyline, we started seeing it was the introduction of Nadia Bjorlin as Chloe Lane slash Ghoul Girl. And we would see this woman, a young woman, child, teenager, in an orphanage. We would hear her sing. And then we started seeing these scenes of Nancy sort of being sort of a little bit dodgy, and she would just sort of disappear for a while and then come back. And Craig was always wondering where she went. And then we finally saw that she was paying this visit to this orphanage, and she was sort of visiting this young teenager child who we find out is Chloe Lane. We find out that Nancy is in fact Chloe Lane's mother, that she placed her for adoption in this orphanage for them to take care of, that she's been sort of sending them money under the guise of charity to sort of help take care of Chloe. And we see that there's this sort of tremendous guilt that Nancy's having over sort of giving up her daughter. And then we find out that Craig obviously has no idea about this. She has no idea that Nancy has a daughter who's in an orphanage. No idea Nancy was pregnant. And just to give you a little bit of backstory here, Craig and Nancy were high school sweethearts. And then I think they broke up for maybe a year or so. And then they sort of got back together in college. And then they've been together ever since. So this sort of explains why Craig doesn't know about Chloe and about Nancy being pregnant and having a baby and placing her up for adoption. So that's sort of their backstory there. But yeah, we sort of have Nancy reveal that she's Chloe's mother. They sort of try and bond. They have their ins and outs as mother and daughter. And then Nancy sort of has the idea of she wants to bring sort of Chloe home to live with her. She does it under the guise of not telling Craig who she is. Craig sort of comes home one day and Nancy's like, surprise, we've talked about having children before. And, I have a relationship with this orphanage as a charity. And I've decided to open up our home to this teenage girl named Chloe Lane, kind of a thing. So it created this weird sort of tension a bit. Craig was just like, what the hell are you doing? You've now adopted a child sort of behind my back. And there was a lot of tension there. Eventually, Nancy did come clean about Chloe actually being her biological daughter. And I think Craig felt a little bit on the outs here because he's known Nancy for so long. They grew up together. They were high school sweethearts. I think he felt sort of betrayed that she didn't confide in him, that she had gotten pregnant, or she sort of wouldn't talk about who Chloe's father was. And that sort of put a little bit of a strain on their marriage. And I think it contributed to Chloe and Craig not exactly sort of bonding when Nancy brought her home. I think they did a lot of the focus on the mother and daughter here. And then Craig sort of felt like the odd person out. He was sort of in conflict with Nancy about keeping this a secret. Because of the way Chloe was sort of brought home and introduced to him, it created a little bit of tension with them. Eventually, they did sort of bond, and Nancy actually eventually sort of revealed that Chloe actually was a product of rape, that Nancy's dad's business partner had basically sexually assaulted Nancy. She got pregnant, and that was the reason why she placed Chloe for adoption, was because of the result of the conception. Or how she was conceived, I should say. And that also explains sort of why she never confided that information into Craig. There was a lot of shame, a lot of hurt that comes along with that. And so she was essentially keeping that a secret and bottling it up. And it's sort of her revealing that went a long way to sort of bringing them together as a family. And then we sort of got this little bit of a, they're sort of bonding as a family. And we got a little bit of a couple different twists here. One was that Chloe was diagnosed with leukemia. So basically everyone was getting tested to be a bone marrow donor. Craig, not being related to Chloe, he could still possibly maybe match. He gets himself tested, and here's where the sort of twist comes in. We find out that Craig is actually the biological father of Chloe. Here's how it went down. Before Craig and Nancy broke up. They had sex for the first time. That's when Nancy actually got pregnant with Chloe. Soon after is when she was unfortunately sexually assaulted by the dad's business partner. She assumed it was the dad's, assumed it was Chloe was a result of that. And that's why she gave her up. And it sort of turned into this not weird misunderstanding, but sort of big revelation. And I think that was sort of the last piece to sort of close in this family and for them to sort of pull ranks with each other, especially now that Chloe's sort of dealing with leukemia. And so it was sort of like, bringing this family together because they're going to need to really fight and they need all their attention and all their resources going to sort of getting Chloe help. And that brings us to sort of the next iteration of their sort of family. And that was Craig and Nancy deciding that they weren't finding a bone marrow donor for Chloe. Things were sort of getting worse or at least stabilized, and they knew they had to find something quick. So they decided to sort of have another baby. And the idea maybe the baby would be a bone marrow match for Chloe, which it was. And then here's where we get the introduction of Joy Wesley. This is the last time we saw Joy Wesley as a toddler here, as sort of before Craig and Nancy sort of exited the show. But of course, we've seen Joy Wesley in modern times. She just sort of left the show a few months ago. We saw an iteration of her as a grown-up, and then this is sort of the story of her conception. She was conceived not just for the mere fact of possibly being a bone marrow donor, but also Craig and Nancy, they were in a happier time. Chloe was sort of stabilized, but they were moving along with trying to get her treatment. And then I think it was the idea of, we missed out on raising our first daughter together. Let's try for another baby that we can sort of raise together as a family, especially now that we've gotten Chloe back. So that was sort of the iteration of Joy Wesley here. She, of course, was a bone marrow donor. Chloe was cured. This is when, at the same time, of course, Chloe is getting with Brady and having their whole saga. They sort of get married, exit stage left, and then Craig, Nancy, and Joy decide to move to New York. And sort of that closes out sort of the more substantial part of the Craig and Nancy storyline over the years. I actually had wished that they stayed in Salem. I think that there was probably a lot more storyline to mine. I think even if Chloe wasn't there, they made a great sort of foil to other people on the show. They had interactions with Roman and Jennifer because of the Carrie and Mike thing. I think they sort of established the Wesleys as really good people, sort of after their initial run of with opposite Carrie and Mike sort of scheming and everything. We didn't really see a lot of that. We did see a lot of sort of, Nancy and her bubbly personality, and we got a lot of sort of medical storylines with Craig, but it was a lot of family contained. I thought maybe they felt like this couple had sort of run its course. I think personally they should have stayed on the show and continued with Joy, even if Chloe was going to be off canvas. I think there was a place for them, but alas, they moved to New York. They periodically would come back as Chloe would come back, particularly Nancy or Craig. Very few times not together, but each of them would sort of come back and pop in for a couple of days or a mini short storyline to help either usher Chloe off or to give her guidance or, kind of a quick visit kind of a thing. We started seeing them coming back around when we had sort of the Last Blast reunion that they did as like a capsule storyline. They brought back Craig and Nancy then. And then we got a couple years ago, 2022, we got word that Craig and Nancy were coming back for sort of this big storyline. We were all sort of waiting to see what that was. And I think none of us would have guessed that this is where they went with them. Now this is Craig and Nancy, almost 20 years later. And this is when this storyline was a bit controversial. I think it still sort of divides people in an interesting way. They, of course, I'm talking when they decide to bring back Craig and Nancy, they decide to reveal that Craig was gay and that this is sort of the storyline of the dissolution of their marriage, of Craig and Nancy sort of parting ways from that, and the revelation that he's gay. He's, at the time, was with Leo. having an affair. Nancy didn't know about it. She suspected something. She sort of trailed him to Salem. He eventually confessed. Nancy was heartbroken, of course, and confused, didn't know what to do. Eventually, they divorced, and it created this interesting discourse um, hmm, about coming out later in life, about feelings, about what did it say about the Wesley marriage all these years? If Craig was gay and always knew, does it sort of take away from what we saw and what we loved about them in the late 90s, early 2000s? We on our show did a lot of talking about this very topic and sort of trying to I think we understood where the writers were going and trying to show a family that was going through dissolution of a marriage, but that they were still family, that Craig and Nancy, there would always be a friendship there, that they were so much alike, and that's what drew them together. Even though Craig supposedly knew he was gay back then, there still was love for Nancy, and there still was an attraction there. And they obviously slept together and had sex during the course of their marriage, and they produced 2 children and all that. And so it just created a lot of discourse. I remember, again, like I said, on our show, we tackled it and talked about it for months. And just trying to maybe get people to understand maybe the perspective of the writers here and what they were trying to do. This story may be unique for daytime, but this is something that happens in the real world, and it is so honest and true. And I think maybe it was a little bit too real or a little bit too out of the scope of people's lives to maybe understand. I think a lot of people did get it. I still think a lot of people maybe are still confused about the storyline, either what they were trying to say, or like I said, does it sort of negate the Wesley marriage of what we saw before? And I don't think it does any of that. I think it just shows the complicated relationships of 2 people who love and cared about each other deeply. Not discounting Nancy's hurt and pain that she went through, but also trying to highlight a coming out later in life storyline and what that looks like and how that affects everyone involved, not just the person who's coming out, but also the family and the children. We saw Chloe's reaction. We didn't get sort of Joy's perspective until later on when she came back on the show, but we sort of Chloe was there to go with it, to go through it with her parents. And I think there was a little bit of a push and pull. She obviously wanted to be on her mom's side, but also had sympathy and empathy for her dad who was going through this. I wish that for this storyline, I really wish they delved a little bit deeper in it. I think they sort of scratched the surface and they gave the bullet points. And I think they were sort of relying on people to understand that. But I think in the long run, it would have been more helpful to go a little bit deeper with these characters. I think we had Nancy sort of stay on the show a little bit longer than Craig did. Things with Leo sort of broke up and he sort of left town, but I think it would have been beneficial for him to stay and for them to work through that, have them bump into each other. I think at the end, it all sort of worked out. They decided to sort of be friends and to have a friendly relationship with each other, which was great because I think, like I said, at the core of it, there's a lot of love there. They admitted that they were best friends with each other. And just because they're not married and, the sort of secrets out and they're all being truthful and honest about who they are with each other now at this stage of their lives, I think there was still more storyline to mine with these 2. Again, we saw Craig sort of leave town back to New York. Hopefully he's happy. We did sort of see the in a full circle moment, really kind of interesting. And I'd love, hopefully we get to see Patricia Darbo come back also with Mike, because we saw that Nancy sort of start to begin a relationship with Mike. And then from commentary from Joy, we realized that Nancy and Mike are still together. So that's sort of this weird full circle moment. 20-something years later, they were brought on as rivals to Mike and Carrie. And now, all this time later, we see that Nancy herself and Mike are in a couple, are together as a couple. So yeah, that was sort of my trip down memory lane for the Wesleys here. I always enjoy when they come back. I love when they come back together. I still think that there's a place for them on the show. I think we've been building up sort of the Gare characters in Salem for, past 15 years now, at least 12 to 15 years now. I think it would be nice to have an older gay man to, from his perspective, come on the show, and maybe bring a partner with him, or sort of see, I think it's nice to sort of check in with Craig and see how he's sort of living his life as an out, sort of comfortable gay man, and to see that on the show, and also to see Nancy. I think she's a fun-loving person. We love when she, after Craig left, she sort of stayed on. We love her relationship with Chloe. We love her relationship with Joy. We love the friendship she started with Bonnie. We'd love to see that continue. So again, I'm always trying to bring these characters back. We have a new sort of writing team on the show. Who knows? We may just, in fact, see the Wesleys in a different iteration soon. So fingers crossed. But yeah, that was this week's edition of Those Were the Days Extended, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.
Those were the